Welcome, hello, good evening. Welcome to the House of European History and to this panel debate on the theme of the debating unity from the 1948 Hague Congress to the Conference on the Future of Europe. I am Emma Bugelli from the House of European History. Our museum presents Europe's history in a way that raises awareness about the multiplicity of perspectives and interpretations, preserving shared and dividing memories. Organizing this panel debate is a way to celebrate two special occasions. One important shared memory, the 75th anniversary of the Congress of The Hague, and Europe's Day. This offers a great occasion to reflect about the Hague Congress's lasting legacy and to look back to other events in the European Union's integration history that have inspired the idea of a united Europe. We will start with a keynote lecture from Brigitte Leucht, who is a reader in international history and politics at the University of Portsmouth since 2015. Before that, she was a postdoctoral fellow at the Department of Politics and International Relations at the University of Oxford and an associate professor of economic history at the University of Copenhagen. Dear Brigitte, I leave the floor to you. Thank you.
So, good evening. Thank you very much, Emma, for the kind introduction. I would like to welcome you all here. It's very nice to see so many faces. Thank you to Steven Van Hecke and also to Lien for organizing the event and for inviting me. So I feel very honored to be here today. This is an important day. It's of course the 9th of May, it's Europe Day. And it's the 75th anniversary of the Congress of The Hague in 1948. So these are very important dates in recent European history. As you see, I'm operating with a slightly different title. It's Debating Europe, but we will get there. We have a panel debate following this, so we will debate Europe and unity. I've actually designed PowerPoint slides for the simple reason it's the evening, you might have had very long days, and this just is to give you some orientation of what I'm doing. So what I thought I could do is actually to address the big question of how Europeans, how citizens have related to Europe and how they have done this through institutions. And this, of course, entails a very difficult question, and I'm not going to be very theoretical tonight, of how citizens participate in government. I've divided the presentation in 4 parts. They are not all equally long. First, I will start basically dissecting the title, which is Debating Europe, and then the 2 elements, the Congress of The Hague, 1948, and the very recent debate on the future, the Conference on the Future of Europe, 21-22. Which of course are 2 different Europes. So I will use the title, in a way the subtitle, to pose 2 questions. One is, which is the Europe we are debating, or the unity of which Europe are we debating? And the second one, who debates Europe? Is it the citizens? Is it an elite? Who is it? And then in the 2, if you like, historical parts, I have a fairly long part on the period following the Second World War, which is when the formative institutions of today's European Union were basically put in place, but not only of the EU, also of other organizations. And I will go a little bit through the Council of Europe, the Schuman Plan and the Marshall Plan, but not in great detail, just to get the big picture out. And then in the sort of second historical part, I'm going to go very much up into the present, just to suggest to you that despite initial ideas being very different, the EU has actually functioned as a site of an increasingly democratic government. And so how can we think about this? And then basically the conclusions, 2 main points. I think that the period after 1945 is extremely important. It is when ideas of Europe get institutionalized. They get institutionalized in certain ways, but then something happens in the EU. And this is in a way what I would like to, where I would like to go with the talk. So I should press this, right? Okay. So if we start with this, basically the big time frame, the Hague Conference and then the Conference on the Future of Europe. 1948, of course, goes back, and this is the picture on top, to an idea, to some extent it goes back to an idea by Winston Churchill on the United States of Europe. Churchill held a very well-received speech in Zurich in 1946, where he emphasized it would be important to find a way for France and Germany to peacefully coexist, and for these two states to constitute the nucleus of a United States of Europe. So this was also a phrase used at the time. And then there were 800 people coming to The Hague in 1948. They were representative of their member states. They were from 17 different states at the time and chosen by a Federalist Joint Committee, by an international committee. And the short version is this Congress led a year later in 1949 to the establishment of the Council of Europe. But then, of course, the Council of Europe, and this is also why I'm going a little bit broader in the early period, is one of many initiatives to unify Europe where European states are supposed to cooperate, work closely together. Then we fast forward to 21-22, the recent conference on the future of Europe. This was launched by three institutions, the European Parliament, the Council, and the European Commission. Three institutions that have nothing to do with the Council of Europe. So it's a separate European regional organization, it's the European Union. And the European Union goes back to other institutional arrangements that were made in the post-World War II period, the Coal and Steel Community and the European Economic Community. So in many ways, these are the institutions that were established in response to the Schuman Plan, 9th of May 1950, today 73 years ago, where only 5 years after the end of the Second World War, France proposed to Germany, West Germany already, to put their joint coal and steel resources under a joint high authority. In terms of participants, the recent conference on the future of Europe actually involved 700,000 EU citizens. So it's much broader than the 800 who were at The Hague in 1948. The European Commission considered this initiative as a major pan-European democratic exercise with citizen-led debates, the first of its kind. So when I read this, and I don't know about you, it makes me think of other things. It does not make me think of the EU. That is not how the EU is usually perceived, I think, as citizens basically tell what to do. So when we are coming together to celebrate the 75th anniversary of the Hague Conference, and when we are thinking about what it means to debate Europe, to debate European unity, I think we need to be very clear about which Europe we are talking about. So I've already said there's the Council of Europe, there is the Europe of the 6 founding member states that established the European Steel Community and the European Economic Community, and starting from 1973, this European community, of course, enlarged, and this is an ongoing process. So there are 27 member states and 10 candidate countries today. There are, of course, within the European Union, different Europes. So there's the Europe of the Schengen area, there's the Europe of the Eurozone. So which Europe are we reflecting on? The second important question raised by this anniversary is, I think, that of who debates Europe. That's really the question where it is about how do citizens, how do Europeans participate in government. So the way I've chosen to address this, there's always a choice in how do you address 75 years, is to really focus on the early period. In terms of the who debates Europe, just to illustrate in a way, this is, of course, these are today's map. Historical maps would look very differently. But it's different geographical scopes that we are talking about here. So this is now very historical. Yeah. On the top, I'm sure you can recognize it's Winston Churchill. So it's again a reference to the Zurich speech of 1946. And then the Congress of The Hague, of course, takes place in the early Cold War. And it is supposed to show that all free countries of Europe, and free meaning non-communist countries, can cooperate and that public opinion is supportive of European unity. So the Congress was convened to demonstrate the unity of European federalists. Federalism was a very broad church, so there was not one set of objectives, not one way to achieve European cooperation and unity. At the Hague Congress, there were 2 main factions, if you like. One were the Federalists, the other one the Unionists. And the titles are a little bit misleading. So the Federalists basically wanted a far-reaching transfer of national sovereignty to the European level and the immediate drafting of a European constitution. The Unionists wanted something that was much slower, that was more incremental. And they wanted to basically very much stick to what is called intergovernmental decision-making, so no transfer of power to the European level. So what happened? At the Congress of The Hague, to put it very simply, the Unionists won. It was a very limited vision of European unity, of European cooperation. So an intergovernmental rather than an integrated Europe was taken forward. And in 1949, the Council of Europe was established, signed by 10 founding member states. Federalists still had some hopes for these institutions once they started operating, but these hopes were soon dashed by basically the behavior of Britain within the Council of Europe, because Britain just simply didn't want to have more than intergovernmental cooperation. Britain backed by the Nordic countries, so it wasn't just Britain. Over time, of course, the Council of Europe would remain significant. So this is not to suggest 1949, there's no European unity, there's no deep integration, if you like, there's no shared sovereignty, and the story is over. It's not over. The Council of Europe is or remains important for two reasons. It does have a parliamentary assembly, however weak the powers are that are granted to this assembly. And the assembly, whose texts are not binding, has defined itself as the democratic conscience of greater Europe. So what is important here is the commitment to democracy, but also a wider Europe than that of the initial 6 founding member states of the European communities narrowly conceived. The second achievement or legacy, if you like, of the Council of Europe and ultimately of the Hague Congress is, of course, that the Council of Europe developed the European Convention for Human Rights. In 1959, a court was established. And this European Convention translated for the first time some of the rights of the UN Declaration of Human Rights into a binding legal instrument. And the interesting thing about the court is, of course, that individuals can call on the court. So an individual, if they have resorted all possible options in the member state, they can call directly on the European Court of Human Rights. Which, of course, if we think about democracy, citizens taking part, it's not taking part in government, but it is important. Still, for federalists in 1949, 1950, the Council of Europe did not work. It was not what they had hoped for. The Council of Europe was important, though, because federalist ideas had made strong inroads into Christian democratic networks, and they were at the time in power in France, Italy, and Germany, and prepared to take the next step, just not in the Council of Europe and not necessarily with Britain. I come to the second organization that I think is important. It's the OEEC, which is the European arm of the Marshall Plan administration. So I've briefly said that the Council of Europe, of course, takes place in the context of the emerging Cold War. Here, the Cold War is even more important. And the cartoon on top, of course, shows Stalin, the Soviet Union's hand reaching deep into not just Eastern and Central Europe, but also Western Europe. So there's a question mark over France. What would the first elections in France after World War II show? So in many ways, the Council of Europe was driven by European federalists. The Marshall Plan, this initiative for a European aid program, for European reconstruction, was driven by American fear, by American concerns over Soviet influence in Eastern Europe. The OEEC shared with the Council of Europe in that there was no real transfer of powers from the member states to the European level. And again, Britain had a guiding role in the OEEC. So this limited progress in both the Council of Europe but also in the OEC was important. It was important because the governments of the 6 continental European countries decided they needed to go ahead even if it meant going ahead without Britain. For the very same reason, the American government reacted favorably when the French Christian Democrats and not the UK government proposed the Schuman Plan. The traditional ally for the Americans were the British. But they backed the French proposal because they also had the experience of the Marshall Plan. And of course, on the bottom of the picture, this is the ERP, again, for European recovery, but also for European unity. So the last of the 3 most important initiatives, I think, is of course the Schuman Plan. So the Schuman Plan embodied a completely different idea of an integrated Europe. there was no constitution establishing the United States of Europe in one daring leap of faith. This is not to say that the men, and they are only men, behind the Schuman Plan did not want a United States of Europe, but they had a different way of bringing this about. The plan was to create strong institutional links in a narrow area in coal and steel. And you can see the cartoon, it's maybe a little bit small, but the cartoon basically shows France and Germany melting the hatchet. So, of course, these are the industries that are used to create weapons. And this is after a series of major wars between France and Germany. The Schuman Plan represented a belief in experts, in technocratic governance. There was nothing about democracy, accountability, legitimacy in setting up especially the core institution, which was the executive, the so-called high authority. So if you like, going back to the conference on the future of Europe, there was no notion of a pan-European democratic exercise. No one wanted this. And the question is, of course, why? Why was it so easy, if you like, to stay away from instituting something that could be more directly accountable to citizens, maybe just in the 6 member states? The reason for this is, if you like, the second image that I've chosen for this slide. This is a fight in a beer hall in Munich in 1930, in which communists and probably Nazis basically fought each other. So one of the lessons of the interwar period that the policymakers, the politicians behind the Schuman Plan had drawn was that direct democracy was actually not a good thing. Direct democracy was associated with street fights. It was associated in the end with mass mobilization, with the rise of fascism and Nazism. So there was a clear intent not to be too close to the citizens. If anything, the political solutions that were developed, like the Schuman Plan, widened rather than closed the gap between the rulers and the ruled. Following the establishment of the coal and steel community, this approach to promote European integration, to some extent European unity, followed this recipe and everything that came with it. So the high authority, this core executive, was to some extent checked and balanced, but really, really weakly. So there was a common assembly attached to the institutional arrangement, but it had no real powers. So what can we take from this founding period? Why so much on the founding period? I think we can see that debates on Europe, ideas about Europe and European unity following the end of the Second World War were actually shaped by 3 developments. One is the experiences of not just the Second World War, but also the interwar period. So if you like, the experience of the lessons of 2 world wars, including the interwar period. And what politicians, policymakers really believed was that political and economic stability could best be safeguarded by establishing new regional organizations. At the time, no one knew what would happen next and which of these institutions, which of these new organizations would take off, as it were. But there was, what we can see, there were so many other initiatives. These are just 3 of the most important ones. The second insight, if you like, is that this Europe, or Europes in the plural, that is being institutionalized, was increasingly shaped by the dynamics of the early Cold War. So in the setup of these institutions, there's something about looking back to the interwar period, how to avoid another, if you like, interwar period. But there's also something that is different and that is looking ahead into the future, the early Cold War. And of course, this had repercussions for the geographical scope of what this Europe could look like. A third observation, and I'm just going to stay on the surface with this one, is of course that these European states that agreed to cooperate together in the Schuman Plan, for example, were waning empires, collapsing empires. And the map I've chosen for this one is actually, I saw it in the exhibition earlier on, is the Pan-Europe map that was, for example, promoted by Richard Coudenhove-Kalergi in the interwar period. So the idea that there's a unity between Europe and the African continent, which you see in the map in black. But this is, of course, not a unity among equals. This is a racial assertion of Europe over Africa. And the interesting thing, and this is, if you like, the more recent historical research has emphasized this trajectory, this path of European integration. The interesting thing is that this idea that was first promoted in the 20s and 30s was adjusted to the realities of the Cold War. So for both Britain and France, this idea, today it seems maybe absurd, of Eurafrica was a way to assert their role as leading powers against superpower preeminence. So there was the US, the Soviet Union, and then you had Britain, you had France, the smaller empires, who also worked with this idea of Eurafrica. What is really interesting, I think, is that in all the organizations I've just introduced to you, the Council of Europe, the OEC, but also the institutions of the coal and steel community, and more importantly, actually, the European Economic Community, there is an element of Eurafrica. So in the OEC and Council of Europe, there were working groups on Eurafrica. So there was no hesitation at the time to basically extend European unity to another continent, so very colonial. And of course, in the interstate negotiations on the European Economic Community, it became a bone of contention for the negotiating parties how to integrate the associated countries, as it was called, so the former colonies basically, into the common market. So there were economic discussions about this. Moving from which Europe to who debates Europe. At first, of course, it appears that the Hague Congress is like the shining hour. Yeah, it has 800 delegates. Everything else is negotiated behind closed doors. So they are the member states, they are representative of the member states that negotiate in the context of the OEC, but also the Schuman Plan and the Rome treaties. But if we take a wider view on this, not necessarily for the Marshall Plan, but for the Schuman Plan, and then later for the European economic communities, these treaties needed to be ratified. There were debates in the national parliament of the member states, and there were debates in the media. This is not to say everyone debated about these treaties, and certainly not in detail, but there was public visibility. So it is not lobbying behind closed doors, as we could also think. How powerful these debates could become is, of course, shown by the failure of the European defense community and the European political community to be ratified due to the no of the French parliament. So there were certain initiatives that were actually blocked. Another one, I think, that is probably less well known, because today we take the common market for granted, is that the common market was very much contested from within Germany, where there were some liberals, order liberals, who basically wanted to see a wider free trade area, for who European regional organization seemed to be too protectionist. So again, challenged from the beginning. Ideas of Europe represented by these regional organizations then have never been only agreed on, they have been challenged. The rationale of the Schuman Plan institutions, so this idea of technocratic governments as far away from the people as you can, this of course did not stand the test of time. And over the next decades, the European community and the European Union had to become more democratic and tried to become more open to citizen input. And I'm going in the shorter second part to basically beyond the founding period, but don't worry, I'm not going into detail of all of these. These are just some of the milestones to actually put them there. In terms of how to think about this, how to think about, if you like, debates on European unity, on Europe after this initial period. I think the one thing to emphasize is, once there are institutions, these institutions have to legitimate why they are there. So they generate debates on Europe. And the most important institution in terms of generating debates is the European Parliament. So in terms of the promotion of democratic values, and also for the articulation, the expression, I hope it's not too tiring, now the lights go off, the expression of federal and constitutional ambitions. So if we think about the EU institutions, of course, we could also say one of the institutions that has really promoted federation is the Court of Justice. But I'm not going to talk about the Court of Justice. We are sort of going to the debates of Europe. The earliest example, and I'm just going to talk about two examples very briefly, is actually the accession request of Franco Spain in 1962. And this is a really interesting example. So there's an external trigger, really, for the European community at the time to deal with this. And what is interesting is that within the European Parliamentary Assembly, this is not called parliament at the time, it's a parliamentary assembly with not great formal powers. There is resistance to including an autocratic regime as part of the economic community. Member state governments are not very vocal about this. It's actually this incipient parliament. What is also interesting to note in this context is in 1962, the Parliamentary Assembly starts calling itself European Parliament, which of course is a little bit reflective of the aspiration of this institution, but also the spirit of the time. So the early years of these institutions starting operating are very positive. But in the debates on this, basically, Social Democrats argue that democracy and human rights would form a prerequisite for joining the communities. So here you have basically the beginning of what become the criteria, the conditionality for joining the EC and later the EU. So this is enlargement in the making, if you like. The second example I'm going to briefly mention is the European Declaration on the European Identity from 1973, again triggered by something external, a reassessment of the transatlantic relationship by the Nixon-Kissinger president and his advisor, and then, of course, Secretary of State. What they did is they basically downgraded Europe in this reassessment. So America, the United States had their global aspirations. Europe was not an equal partner, but could be useful in a European regional context. European leaders were offended. And at the 1973 summit in Copenhagen, the heads of state and government issued this declaration on the European identity. And what we have in this declaration is, again, the insistence of defending the principles of representative democracy, the rule of law, social justice, which is actually quite revolutionary given how weak social policies were at the time, and again, respect for human rights. So there are values. There is a commitment to democracy. This is 1973, just after the first enlargement. And this, of course, is in many ways the basis for what is sometimes called the civilian power that the EU has become. What is important in terms of the historical context, this is no longer the period after the Second World War. In the 1970s, there is, of course, economic decline, there are recurrent economic crises, and European institutions try to strengthen their political and their popular legitimation. The debates on the democratic deficit come from this time. So two further initiatives that I'm just going to mention is the 1975 Tindemans report and then the draft treaty establishing a European Union in 1984. They're all initiatives that want a lot of things, but that are also trying to strengthen the European Parliament. Then I'm not going to go into details of the treaty establishing a constitution for Europe 2004 and the very recent conference. Instead, what I would like to do in the finishing slide is basically try to suggest a different way of thinking about debates on Europe. Yeah. So in many ways, the problem is that once there are institutions, the focus is on institutions. What can institutions do? There is a different way of thinking about this, and this is a much more, if you like, bottom-up perspective. And this is basically to say that from the beginning, European citizens have actually engaged with institutions. They have engaged with certain institutions within the Commission, for example, representing certain policies. So once there are institutions, once there are policies, and I have an example of this on the picture, which I will explain in a moment, citizens do engage. There might not be the 700,000, but they engage honestly. They engage from the point of view that concerns them. And this is something, and this is more, I would say, where historical research is at the moment going. It's looking at these things that we've missed, I think. Yeah, this is not something that starts miraculously out of nowhere with the Maastricht period. This starts much earlier. This starts in the period that is very often called the period of the permissive consensus, where basically European citizens knew there was this thing called the European Community, but no one seriously engaged with it. It started from the beginning, and the example is the Farmers' March on Brussels in 1971, which of course was a critique of the common agricultural policy, probably one of the most criticized policies. So this is not to suggest that every EU EC policy had this visibility, but there is a different way in terms of what it means to debate Europe. And I'm already at the concluding remarks. So I think the emphasis on the founding period, this institution making period, is important because there are certain past dependencies that are created. So the idea by creating institutions in a certain way, you exclude other possibilities. To go back to where I started, the Council of Europe and the predecessors of the Community of the Union, by designing the Council of Europe in a very intergovernmental way, with very limited transfer of power to the European level, in many ways, and there are of course examples, to some extent it remained a talking shop, because if you can't legislate, what can you do? How can you govern? Again, there are exceptions like the Court of Human Rights, I think. But in many ways, it didn't fulfill the potential because of the way it was set up. Similarly, to begin with, the predecessor institutions of the European Community, European Union. But then, of course, it did not work with the approach that was taken in coal and steel. It did not work anymore once there was the common market. So some element of democratic government and governance had to be introduced over time. And I would think that it is a fruitful way to, of course, we can look at all these debates in more detail, but it might be even more interesting, and that interests me at the moment, to think of the democratization and to think about these debates from below. It is, of course, much more punctuated. So you don't get the overall 700,000, but you might really get what citizens in some areas were actually thinking about Europe and European unity. Thank you very much.
Okay, good evening. My name is Steven Van Hecke. I'm Associate Professor in Comparative and New Politics at University of Leuven, also responsible for a fund, Involve EU, and also a fresh member of the Academic Council of the House of European History. So I will watch my words. I would like to ask the other panelists to come to the floor. For the second part of this evening, so the first part we just had the keynote by Brigitte Leucht. The second part is the panel debate, and at the later stage this evening we'll also reach out to the audience for the Q&A session. And for the audience here and also everyone watching at home, I'm already announcing that of course you will be able to raise questions here, but also digitally, so please do not hesitate and prepare your smart and short questions. But that's for later on. First, I want to introduce the three other panel members very briefly. From your left to your right, Cristina Blanco Sío-López. She's Senior Distinguished Researcher at the University of La Coruña. And everything else you will find on the internet. It applies to all the panel members, so I will be short. Jacopo Cellini, he's a research fellow at the Alcide De Gasperi Research Center of the EUI, European University Institute in Florence. And Timofey Agarin, he's a reader in comparative politics and ethnic conflict at Queen's University in Belfast. Which means that we try to have, yes, you might see, all kind of directions, a bit north, a bit south, a bit east, and a bit west, even if you would know our nationalities, or even more. Before I start with the panel members, Brigitte, I want to just follow up very briefly with one question. Your last comment, you said it was a kind of a plea for a more bottom-up approach. would that also include, where everything started with, the European movement? Because after all, it was the European movement that has organized, of which, if I'm not wrong, of which Winston Churchill was the honorary president, that the European movement was initiating that now famous Congress of The Hague 75 years ago. Do you think at these kind of organizations, and do they still matter? Just a brief reply. What do you have in mind when taking into account more bottom-up approaches?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think in many ways, as in presentations, we work with the big names, right? It is the idea of presenting to people in the evening a face they recognize. But I think to some extent we know quite a lot actually about the federalist movement. In many ways that's where what this field that is called the history of European integration started. So in the beginning I think there was an emphasis on trying to understand how federalist ideas were, for example, born in the context of the resistance movements during World War II. So that's actually the interesting thing. It started with the bottom up, but then what was missing was what has now, I think, held back some of what we have been doing in recent decades, an emphasis on impact. So I've talked a lot in a way about institution building. You couldn't show this really beyond the Conference of The Hague, the Council of Europe, how federalist ideas actually mattered to specific, setting up specific institutions. Other approaches were developed to show this better. And what I have in mind is really to turn it around, because I think a lot of the historiography, the writing on the European Union and how it developed over time has been focused on understanding decision-making. So to stay with the common agriculture policy, how was this negotiated? Who wanted what? Who were the people perhaps behind the scenes? But this is an elite history. And we are now only beginning, I think, to turn it around. Maybe the CAP is actually an example where we know a little bit. But we don't know a lot about, for example, how regional policy was perceived in Cornwall. But of course, Cornwall benefited from regional policy. Yeah, it was one of the trade-offs was that Britain sort of, that's how the simple version goes. Britain paid for the cap, but they got the regional policy. Yeah, so these are stories where it is necessary to do the research differently. You're not going for the big negotiations. You're going for the little stories. And I think this is what I find at the moment promising in terms of developing debates on Europe. But this doesn't mean that going back to The Hague is pointless. It's a different kind of story you tease out.
Okay, the same story, but from a different perspective. And as I understood, a lot still needs to be done. So this might not be the last panel from this perspective organized here in the House of European History. I'll continue with the panel members as a kind of a warming up round, what their impressions are from Brigitte's keynote. Cristina, what was new, what was interesting from your perspective? Yeah, or you can share the microphone with Jacopo. Okay, good.
I hope it works properly. Yes? Okay. So you can hear me. Yeah, first of all, I would like to start, I mean, Brigitte finished her presentation with a lot of food for thought, as you were saying, but also challenges and contestation, I mean, this final idea. And I would like to start with a note of hope and talk about something that, I mean, it's not just about the topic of the presentation or the idea of European unity, but something we might be actually missing overall in this whole debate, which is the idea of joy. I mean, we even have the ode to joy. And at some point, the work of European integration was a work of joy, of compelling arguments, of commitment, of social engagement, as you were mentioning. No? So I think it's possible to be creatively critical and constructive, but also having this idea of not just having to survive situations, and we just come from a pandemic, from a debt crisis, identity crisis in European integration. So beyond all these crises, I mean, a sense of thriving and not just surviving is something that can maybe connect to something that we don't have right now, which is a European movement. I mean, we were seeing that in all the artifacts and the stories of the visit we just made to the museum. We don't have such a compelling level of social organization and commitment and working together with joy, again. So that's a hopeful note. And I also wanted to take into account something very important you did with your presentation, which is focusing on benchmarks. And at the same time, being very conscious that it's not like in science. I mean, in science, we talk about the Kuhnian model, the big leaps, and the win-win. But we cannot say the same about European integration. We can argue that European integration advances or moves forward or backwards sometimes through responses to crisis. So maybe we need to better reflect on which are those crises and what do they generate? I mean, we can mention so many of them, the empty chair crisis or the Brexit nowadays or the debt crisis or, I mean, so many different crises through the history of European integration and how we advance through responses to crisis, which is a very particular way of moving in different directions. And I think there's something you mentioned in your presentation, but I think we need to get deeper into that. You mentioned the idea of getting wider, new member states and so on, but this is connected to two very classic dichotomies in the dynamics of the European integration process, which I would like to use your presentation as a starting point to maybe launch, I don't know, a deeper debate on that, which is intergovernmental approaches on the one hand, supranational approaches on the other, and the tension that causes also in interinstitutional relations, and also, again, deepening versus widening, and also something I call instrumental peripheries, because when we talk about widening, we talk about new members to a club, we talk about inclusion, we talk about new borders, new frontiers, exclusion, and so on. But how these peripheries that could become part of core Europe, which is also a very contentious concept, are part of the core in times of relative prosperity or relative stability, but they become again the poor relative and the periphery in times of crisis. So how these peripheries are instrumental. I think this is something that we should, I don't know, fight and attack as an argument as historians. And also, when you talk about all these benchmarks, all these turning points, something that colleagues in other disciplines call critical junctures, I think it's also something very much related to the visit we made to the museum. Who chooses the turning points? Who tell us when a turning point in history is a turning point and why? So I think that brings in a very strong way a question that is haunting us, but also being very inviting in terms of letting us develop our critical analysis perspective as historians. So the agency in defining turning points in history, which is also very much related to change in history and the possibility of making that change. So before coming to the session today, I was reading this poem by Rabindranath Tagore, and he said that we were invited to lightly dance on the edge of time, like dew on the tip of a leaf. And I think that's what we are here today. We're dancers on the edge of time. But this is not just a risk, as it could seem. You are on the edge. I think this is also power. I think it's something empowering. And specifically, the whole point of knowing more about history is to empower us all with critical arguments. So I would say that this is a starting point for really critical debates, but very empowering ones. And I thank you very much for this chance of sharing thoughts with you all. Thank you.
Thank you. Jacopo, what are your immediate responses to Brigitte's presentation?
Yes, I'm sorry, I will use more profane words than these inspiring words by Cristina. There are two aspects that struck me in this remarkable Brigitte lecture. The first one concerns the number of options, of ideas and institutions which were in play in the immediate post-war concerning the coming together of European nation-states and how they were rooted in the history and in the events of European history in the first half of the 20th century. European integration didn't follow a clear and consistent path right from the start, but as any historical process, it was influenced by many factors and could have taken many different directions. So I think that's something that we should keep in mind. And the second and related point is about this contested notion of Europe. This is also not only a recent development, as we might think, linked to the growth of Euroscepticisms and alternative visions for Europe. But again, as we just heard, it's something that has deep historical roots and is connected to this history from below. And this is something that has also to do with the public perception of the debates over European unity, with how they were portrayed and perceived by European citizens. So that's it for now. Maybe I will try to elaborate a little bit more in the course of the debate. But thank you, Brigitte, for this lecture.
Okay, thank you, Jacopo. Timofey, the same question for you. Did anyone surprise you in the presentation of Brigitte?
No surprises for me, but I was delighted to hear a history of European institutional development. I think this is a worthwhile recap of what we have seen across the European continent for the past half a century in the first instance. But what is important, I think, from my perspective, that's a story of accidental developments that were, as my predecessor mentioned, effectively reflect on crisis management mode that European Union has evolved into. And interestingly, I'm probably the only non-historian in the round. So as a political scientist treating this discourse on European Union evolution, would really miss the perception of citizens in this evolution. So though crisis management ultimately is there to serve citizens better, it is a short-term thinking that is needed to resolve crisis moments, and there is usually little or no time to consult with citizens on long-term perspectives, thus also lack of normative value-laden discussions that set a long-term perspective on the European Union integration. And that is along these lines that I will be coming back to, I think, the presentation that Brigitte has made.
Okay, thank you. And no worries, you're not the only historian here in the front. Big question for the panel members, debating unity from the 1948 Hague Congress to the Conference on the Future of Europe. What is, given the diversity of the background of the panel members, what is your perspective, expertise, experience? How would you describe this idea of debating unity over such a long period? Cristina.
Okay, yes, this is a really big question, but I think I have taken two different perspectives. As a historian, I have a personal motto, which is looking back into the past in order to see beyond, to address the challenges of the present. So this is the hope, this is just the aspiration, and I try to take two different variables. One is it will look like a tree if I would have to describe it. So the roots of the tree are time. So this is more the intimate roots. Time is the intimate roots. And space is the projection. So it would be the rest of the tree. And I'm working a lot in terms of a space about the history of human mobility rights in European integration, about this fundamental right to have rights of moving, of being allowed to move. And I think this is a very timely question, surrounded by many controversies and constraints, and, but also many potentials. So what I try to look is for archival documents. I conduct interviews with persons who decided to go beyond the free movement, as we know, capitals and goods and services, and it was something that precisely happened, especially at the European Parliament. I felt very identified with what you just said about the Assembly and the Parliament defending this fundamental right to have rights, that is the freedom of movement of persons. So when looking at these documents and at the historical archives of the European Parliament, I discovered really fascinating notions. For instance, the idea of space as a vehicle. So a space as a vehicle of possibility. And I thought, okay, this is fascinating. And what does it mean? And I found a conducting thread with the idea of solidarity. There was this attempt, this notion of trying to find a model for human mobility rights in the Schengen area that is not limiting but enabling. And the conducting thread for that was solidarity as a fundamental pillar. Against that was seen as a form of unity, as a potential for unity. So the whole idea of moving across the continent, of Europe as an architecture of interactions, a space of potential, or as this space as a vehicle, was the whole idea that there is a dichotomy that it was becoming growingly clear through the years. I mean, it's something very classical. You can see it also in documents and artifacts from many centuries ago, is the liberty versus security dichotomy. And I think that in the field of human mobility rights, migration, asylum, it's something that we are currently seeing very graphically. On the one hand, you have actors defending the protection of fundamental rights and freedoms, and not just democracy. We're talking in Brigitte's presentation about democracy, but about the quality of democracy. So that's on the one hand. On the other hand, we see a growing mindset that is being defined by surveillance, control, and security. And in that sense, what you can find in these very interesting documents in the Parliament about the development of the Schengen area, how we need to defend this basic freedom of movement of persons, is the whole idea that we can transform control and surveillance into a sense of responsibility. And also how we are losing sight of what peace, I mean, one of the fundamental pillars and the fundamental principles of the whole process of European integration is. And what many of these different archival collections say is that peace is more than the absence of conflict and the presence of security. There is an ingredient of community building that defines unity, precisely. And I think it's something we have been forgotten, to the point that we are erasing the fundamental questions about what is a home. And I think it was something very present as well in Brigitte's presentation. What does make a home, a common home? How do you keep a home? Because what you see many times is just the agony to try to maintain a structure. But when you are in a community, that is a home. So peace seen as community building is coming back to roots we have forgotten. And also we have neglected these questions of who do we want to be? And what have we forgotten through all this time? What have we forgotten of who we wish to become, which is a fundamental identity question. So that's from the point of view of space, and just very briefly, a quick point on time. I work on the instillment of time perceptions in the communication policy about enlargement processes in the southern enlargement, also the eastward enlargement. So what I study is how the perception of time is instilled. And Brigitte, in your presentation, you were also speaking about the growing gap between citizens and institutions, and also that being a source of crisis, of forms of unity that bring together the top-down and the bottom-up. So when you see that there are different perceptions of time, like a new beginning, when there's a new enlargement, and members of a periphery are becoming a core, and this is seen like a new opportunity. It was felt in some places in the 1990s. It was felt with transitions into democracy in Southern Europe in the mid-70s, for instance. That's the perception of a new beginning. And at the same time, when there are turning points that they are being forced upon because they are part of a business model or a branding, because you were also asking, like, which Europe? Europe as a brand, and this is something that concerns me a lot. The idea that these fundamental principles of peace and socioeconomic cohesion and solidarity as a fundamental principle, they are being co-opted, and there's just a shadow place to use them as a part of this branding, as a part of a business model that in the practice applies the exact opposite agenda. So this is a very risky development in that sense. And of course, when this creates turning points that are artificial and they don't correspond with the concerns of society at that time, because you can tell people, well, I mean, this enlargement process here or there is a turning point in history. But maybe the main societal concerns are, I'm a young person, will I find a job? Will I ever have a place to live? Will I have a pension? Is there sustainable forms of opportunity for us within society? There's a lack of correspondence between the time that is instilled by institutional communication and the time that is societally perceived. So this creates also a sense of dissociation, a sense of detachment, and a growing gap between citizens and institutions. So I think the co-option is something we really need to study deeper. And just to finish, I think that this is part of a quest that historians have to chart the intangible. But sometimes these identity questions, these societal concerns, they are really they detach the map and the territory. They totally spoil the identity, to the point that we forget many interesting facts. And here, if I may, I come back to Brigitte's presentation, because I have just two very short anecdotes to share about what you said, for instance, about the case of Spain, the Spanish application, and the Parliamentary Assembly. And there was something fascinating that happened later on during the transition to democracy in Spain. There were some resistance, some reluctances coming from different actors and parties. And for instance, in the UK, the British representatives discussing the transition to democracy in Spain, and now that they appeared to be democratic, they were given or not a chance to apply and to become a candidate country and a member. They said, okay, what we need is something we have decided to call a certificate of democracy. And to me, it sounded very similar to the Copenhagen criteria, because they were setting benchmarks in the same way that was happening in 1993 with Central and Eastern European countries being candidates after the European agreements and the end of the Cold War. So, but something happened in the parliament, something happened in this former assembly, because they told the British, no, we don't accept that you ask to any potential candidate that has undergone a transition to democracy for a certificate of democracy. Because the only persons who can certificate that a democracy is real and is happening and the country is being transformed is the internal opposition and it's the citizens. So that was so different to what we know about the case of Central and European countries and the approach of monitoring, the closely monitoring and closing the chapter of the acquis and having to behave as a member state before becoming one. So that was, when I think about it, it's like creating a different timeline. It's very, very interesting. And then you also mentioned the OEC. And there's a very interesting anecdote from that point of view as well. When I was interviewing the persons at the European Commission who decided which was the way that the eastward enlargement of the European Union should undertake in the 90s to achieve an actual implementation of this enlargement process, they thought, okay, let's not grant any kind of future membership possibility. The model we should follow is that of the OEC. Those were the reluctant parties, and they didn't win. But that was on the table, and I think that's fascinating. So thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Jacopo, the same question for you. What is your contribution, given your expertise, to the topic debating unity?
Yeah, well, Steven, when I was preparing for this debate, I immediately thought about the figure of Alcide de Gasperi, and in just 3 to 4 minutes I will tell you his story and maybe you'll understand why. So De Gasperi became Italy's prime minister in December 1945, and then he held the position until August 1953. He is, of course, best known as one of the statesmen who kicked off the process of European integration, who worked for the unification of Europe as a federal state, in particular through the project of a European defense community back in the early 1950s, as was mentioned by Brigitte, that was supposed to be the core of a democratic and federal Europe, and then didn't see the light after it was rejected by the French National Assembly. But how did he become a European federalist? Well, his biography is very interesting, I think, in this respect. De Gasperi was born in 1881 in a little village in Trentino, which is now a northern Italian region. But back then, it was part of the Habsburg Empire, of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And for exactly half of his life, for 37 years, He was a citizen of this empire, of this peculiar, unique institutional setup in contemporary Europe, a multi-ethnic empire where different nationalities coexisted under a supranational authority. And this influenced how he approached one of the critical issues of contemporary European history, that is the issue of the nation and nationalism. He didn't follow this powerful line of thought which came out of the revolutions of the 18th and 19th century, that every national identity must have a territory and decision-making powers, or every nation needs a state. This was not the case in de Gasperi's mind. He thought that different national identities, like the Italian, the German, the Polish, the Hungarian, could coexist in the same institutional framework, provided that they were granted autonomy and rights. And the Habsburg Empire, in his mind, was a perfect example of this opportunity. Then he came to reflect more closely and dramatically, I would say, on the idea of nation. First, when Trentino was annexed to Italy after the First World War, and then, of course, when fascism tried to build a totalitarian state based on an aggressive and exclusive idea of nation. De Gasperi was persecuted by fascists, he was arrested and forced into some sort of internal exile in the Vatican. So when he became Italy's leader after the Second World War, he knew that a sort of intellectual reframing of the nation was needed to link this idea with values like peace, freedom, and democracy, free from the chains of nationalism. And this idea of nation, here I come to the point, was perfectly compatible with a larger cultural, political, and institutional framework represented this time not by an empire, but by a union of free European nation states, united in diversity, to quote the current EU motto. But in the beginning, he didn't care much what form or shape such unity should take among the many options that we remember were on the table. Then, between the late 1940s and the early 1950s, he became convinced that the best way forward was a federation of states, so a political union with substantive powers and democratically accountable, as this was the best way not only to protect the Italian interests, but also to engage the European peoples with the European idea, or myth, as he used to say. So you see how many of the points that were raised earlier were at play in the intellectual reflection of a man who I wouldn't define as much as a founding father with this narrative implying often some sort of clairvoyance, a capacity to read into the future, while in fact he was a European man who tried to read into the past. A European man born into the tensions of our recent past, who tried to come up with a solution for a peaceful and beneficial coexistence between different peoples, where different identities could live together without fighting. And this is, in the end, a challenge which he did not overcome, because most of his European projects failed in the end, at least at the time. But it's a challenge which I think it's still in front of us today, 70 or 80 years later, de Gasperi's time, and is still front and center in any debate over European unity.
Okay, thank you. And interesting to see how this whole history is condensed in one person's life. I will give the floor to Timofey, but then later on to the audience, so please keep your questions ready, also those following online. Timofey, the same question for you. Given your expertise, what would you add to this story of debating unity?
Thank you. Well, I think there is one foundational issue that all of us are reflecting upon, is how the personal histories became reflected in the institutional evolution that we have seen across Europe now, and how individual preferences of political elites have also come to matter in contemporary Europe today. I think this is important from Jacopo's perspective as well, and individual biographies really mattered, and how what we now recognize as European Union. And in this context, I think it's important to also look back to the Hague Congress and the recommendations that were spelled out, and originally, in my view, were laying the building blocks for what we know now as European institutional architecture. So the political community, and I had to check this myself, suggested at the day that participating states should transfer and merge some portion of their sovereign rights to maintain their sovereignty and cooperate in political sphere more closely. At the same time, the Economic Committee that was meeting, that was passing the its advice to participating states suggested that no attempt to rebuild the economy of Europe upon the basis of rigidly defined national sovereignty can prove successful. And I think both of these things reflect our experiences as citizens of Europe today. They reflect those experiences of founding fathers, usually fathers of Europe, and the experiences of people who lived in border areas in crumbling empires, the empires that crumbled after the First World War. Essentially, from my perspective, the view of European cooperation that chimed in the political and economic rationale of the European Union as we see it today was already to be seen at the Hague Congress. But also what I see from perspective of my research in the Hague and conclusions is that it is the elite that decided what is good for the people. So the elite, political leaders were there to lead and publics were there to follow. There was very little concern for what people's opinions were. If anything, they were probably very expedient at the time. But at the same time, what we have seen a European Union becoming today, it reflects on many of aspirations that individual Europeans share, and that is having a prosperous, secure life, and that is important because we are ultimately looking at the European Security Organization here, and at the same time, it is the life of security in both your individual choices as a person, the respect for human rights and equality, and also as a member of wider community of citizens of your member states. And that links an individual to the states through their citizenship and thus also to the wider EU-wide project that brings everyone into the fold into the common purpose of the European integration project, vesting us all with an interest in maintaining the stability and peace and encouraging in everyone level of participation and engagement with the shared project. Why this is important from my perspective? Because at the beginning, we have seen that there was an elitist project of establishing a set of political institutions that would facilitate cooperation largely between states, between economies of states, which also reflected pretty much the story of the Westphalian world order that has been dominant at the day. But today, the contestation across European Union member states, European Union member state societies to be more specific, is carried out around issues that are of distributional nature. We are all seeing contestations about access and distribution of resources within the European Union society, because all EU member state citizens are supposed to be equal. So there is an inherent perception in many who are not as equal as other EU member citizens, that they are not getting their fair share of the benefits that were promised to them. But from my concluding perspective on the European Union integration, I think an important takeaway should be that though across the European Union we are, as EU citizens, equal, there are various inequalities within the European Union, but these are particularly sharply perceived if we are observing the process happening in European societies from outside of the EU. And for that perspective, the view from The Hague 75 years ago is essential because it promised that every country, or encouraged every country to develop democratic governance. It encouraged every country to, every potential member state to implement equality of its citizens and ensure that every person's aspirations can be respected as that person would like them to be perceived. And that is playing back to the citizen and playing back to societies to determine what they would like to do. Thus, the promise of the Hague Congress is still to be fulfilled, I think, in the context of contemporary European Union.
Okay, thank you. We're not finished yet. Neither here. Anyone from the audience who wants to raise a question? Yes, one from the third row.
Yes. Thank you, first of all. Very interesting. And my question is foresight related. So here we had a bit of a look on the past regarding European. Oh, sorry. So, as I said, my question is related to foresight. We've had a bit of a look on the past regarding European institutionalization and debating unity, but how do you see the future regarding unity and institutionalization? Where do you see that in 2050, or where do you see it going? And certainly taking into account ongoing discussions on strategic autonomy or European sovereignty. And so that's a little bit of a future question, but we can also, that's maybe a second question, how do you see that European unity within this strategic autonomy debate, so currently, so future-wise and currently?
Okay, thank you. Anyone from the panel who wants to respond to this? Brigitte, maybe how should we organize debating unity in the future?
If I had the answer. Well, thank you for your questions. I don't really like the term unity, to be honest. I know we are sort of, that's the heading of the evening, but I think if we have anything learned from the past, and I think I find it really difficult to go into the future without at the same time looking into the past like Cristina has done, right? I think it's that basically the European Union actually works because it's possible to have different overlapping unities, if you like, right? So I started in the beginning with the Eurozone and the Schengen area, but I think this is a trend that has been going on for many years. The idea that, of course, it is possible to pass legislation over some member states. Yeah, there is sort of majority voting. So these are all indications, I would say, that unity is perhaps not the key term in terms of thinking towards the future. And this is not a critique of you because you picked up the question of the evening. But I think it is much more a question of cooperation, integration, and what is in the scholarship what is called differentiated integration. So it is actually not a bad thing, you know, that not everything is sort of fully integrated. And as sort of to take it more to the current state, I think one of the interesting things I've read around a little bit in preparation for today, and is that post-Brexit, the approval rates for the European Union are again really high. It's not surprising because we see it doesn't work. We knew this before. If people had opened any history books or maybe come here, it's not so difficult to understand why it doesn't work. So basically, European Union is popular. At the same time, I think that the institutions and some of the law, the policies they produce are as contested as never before. And I think, and again, it's of course, in this case, it's an Eastern European state. But if I think of Poland, Hungary, but there were also, for example, these are more sort of nitty-gritty stories, yeah, judgments where the German highest court challenged a little bit, the European Court of Justice. So we have almost like this strange. It is not a gap, but it's almost like two tendencies going in different directions. So what do we make of this? As historians, and that's the nice thing, the job is to look back. So there are limitations to my prophecy, I would say. But I think the job is almost to understand much more the tensions, much more to understand this didn't start with, for example, UKIP. This didn't start with the Law and Justice Party in Poland. This started with how enlargement was done, for example, and the conditionality and not taking on board other images, other plans for Europe. So I think that there is not much potential in thinking about unity. And I don't mean this as I'm not sure this sounds joyful, this is not, but this is not a no to, it's a pragmatic answer, I would say.
Okay, thank you. Cristina, do you want to respond to this very briefly?
Very briefly, thank you for your question. I'm a historian, so I don't know if scenario design is what I can provide, but I just wanted to say that there's something we have been forgetting when we were talking about elites or also the grassroots. So there's a big discussion about how an economic union can rely on the work and the support of elites. But if you want to build a political union, you need citizens. So that would be the stage that we have been trying to achieve lately. But I think we are moving towards a new stage. We can call our time as an era of disruption. But disruption has a ductility. And this ductility in an age of disruption gives you a power. So I think that the key, and for instance, Brigitte was now mentioning all these liberal democracies, hybrid regimes, and so on. I think they are maintained on the basis of fear. You talk about strategic autonomy, and what is really maintaining that, this appearance and this existence, is fear. So the next step after having this consciousness of becoming citizens to achieve, if we want, a political union, would be to ditch fear and to unfold our potentialities. So that can be a way into the future. And something else I wanted to mention is, I don't know, this metaphor of tending a garden. I mean, if you tend a garden, some days you have to apply some water, some days you don't, some days you have to let the sun just stay there, and you have to do different things, different days, at different times for the same garden to continue growing. So there's a kind of declination and adaptation and day-to-day and observation. And you can only do that if you have this consciousness of being and the willingness of being part of this community. So maybe unity is not the word, but community can be the way forward. So just a thought. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I think it was Jacopo, you can correct me, it was one of the founding fathers of the Italian state who said, we created Italy, now we need Italians. Yes. Which I would say does not really apply to the EU. I think the EU leaves much more diversity than unity compared to the member states' record. Maybe the European Union learned a good lesson. Anyway, the second question was about strategic autonomy. I wanted to drop it in front of the panel members. Is strategic autonomy pitched by Emmanuel Macron not another example of top-down debating unity or Europe? Would you agree? Timofey?
Tricky one, huh?
Yes, that is my role, to ask tricky questions to the panel members.
I think my answer would need to start by saying that I believe the usage of the word strategic autonomy actually hides more than it opens. As with many statements by almost every political leader, it is there to engage and convince public that it is a good thing to do. I'm not entirely sure there is much of a substance behind what is meant by strategic autonomy, but it sounds to me that Macron was appealing to people to see strength in its own policies and its own commitment to normative as well, and normative standards and many strategic policies that are already in place in Europe. So from that perspective, if we take a realist approach to this strategic interpretation of what strategic autonomy might have been, it is a useful concept. It is a useful rhetorical tool to convince people that there is worth in pursuing the project that we are in together. But from exactly the same perspective, it is also a dangerous one, because for many people, what political elites tell us is very often vague and is interpreted by people on the ground in various ways, in ways that they see fit. And that doesn't mean that people can take the messages from political elites, turn them on their head, but it can mean that there is no consent to the message that is projected by political elites, which in itself is not a problem unless there is a crisis around the corner. And that crisis is already then, I think Macron's statement precisely has been made precisely in the context of the crisis mood that we are there now. We need the European Union needs a strategic autonomy, or needs to declare strategic autonomy in the face of challenges from outside of European Union, but also to increasing challenges that we see on the ground in societies, with many conflicts, unresolved inequalities being presented to people as reflecting the lack of commitment of the EU to equality and standard of living for all citizens. So it's a dangerous two sides of the sword.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions from the audience? Please feel free.
It's also kind of a question. All the movements for more cooperation or more integration, or like to make more federalist movements, all come from high politicians like Macron, Olaf Scholz. They all have their own vision on more European cooperation. But do you think there's a lack of movement from the public itself, because maybe the European Union is not fully democratic and people can't rally around people for more European integration?
Okay, thank you for this question. Brigitte, do you want to reply?
I think you're right. I would agree with you. I mean, the thing is, if you think that the policy direction, the big questions are not decided in the European Parliament. I mean, the Parliament has more powers now than it used to have. But I think there is something that is wrong with this in a way. So I think what is sort of where there is sort of a certain sense of security now is that European Union membership is better than non-membership, yeah, for economic reasons, for security reasons. So I think this has to some extent been proven, if you like. This does not mean that there is no Euroscepticism, that there are no parties who work with basically what doesn't work. But I think the old problem is really how do you engage citizens? And I think I'm not sure, to be honest, but I think the one thing that we as researchers can do, and I liked also some of Cristina, what you introduced as your approaches to understanding, for example, different visions of Europe that have not been integrated, that are not present in what I just presented, for example, or these contestations. The problem is you don't get then the 700,000. But if I'm honest, if you mention to your friends maybe who don't come to events like this, the conference on the future of Europe, how many of them know actually what happened? How many have read the 335 pages that is the final report? And I'm not saying it shouldn't happen. I think there's a responsibility of institutions, with basically paid parliamentarians. Of course, they should look after this. But I don't think it is the only way to get citizens. Yeah, the citizens you get when their daily lives are affected, be it for security reasons, be it because, I don't know, prices increase. So it is different things to look out for, I think. But I have not got the one good answer, I'm afraid.
Cristina, yes, and then there's another question from the back.
Very briefly as well, I will try to start with something poetic and finish with something very practical. So, on the paper, and I mean the willingness, the theoretical proposition of precisely the conference on the future of Europe, it reminds me something that many centuries ago, in the Middle Ages, Hildegard von Bingen said, like, an interpreted idea is not a home. Something that is interpreted for you without your say, without your voice, cannot be a home, cannot be a community. So the fact that there's a chance to express your unique voice, your own idea, to share it, to make it come to the fore, seems like a very good opportunity. But on the practical side, and this is something I'm experiencing when moving to different countries, living in different towns, in different municipalities, they all have a website saying, hey, we have this new administration, this new government, so please upload your ideas and we will try to implement them. And this is something similar in spirit to this proposal by the Conference on the Future of Europe. And what I think, honestly, is like, if I or me and another person or several of us, we have ideas, why not standing for office? I mean, we're talking about the representative democracies. So me and you or several of us, we should stand for office and we should have a program. And those ideas should be points of our program and they should be our proposals and we should take credit from them, for them and defend them and not just hand them to others to say like, oh yes, this is really deliberative and this is really participative democracy. I think there's a sense of ownership, of commitments that it's being delegated. And we shouldn't stop being brave and saying, this is what I want to materialize, this is what I want to be manifested or incarnated in reality. So I might find a lot of difficulties and challenges, but I will try to find ways to bring that into existence, together with others and so on. So I think there's a kind of disconnection from this traditional and I think very interesting idea of representative democracy that we should explore in a deeper way. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Next question from the back, please.
Thank you. Thanks for an interesting debate so far. I have two short questions. First, I wanted to come back very briefly to this question of what is unity and what is union. Because I hear you say, like, why unity is not the right word. Because, well, we've got also in Europe, majorities now overruling minorities in the council, right? But this whole idea of having majorities and minorities could also say that that's just democracy, right? So the question is a little bit, what's the benchmark for European unity? At what point can we say, okay, now we're unified, now we're a union? And are our criteria for European Union not too strict, not too strong? I mean, there are 17 different political parties in the Netherlands, yet no one would say that the Dutch state is not unified, that there is a risk of deunification of the Dutch state, right? So what are our criteria for talking about union and unity? And are the criteria applied to Europe not unrealistic when compared to the criteria we apply to the classic nation state? First question. Second question, I very much appreciate your call across the panel for a more bottom-up citizen approach. I think that's definitely necessary, and I really like this idea of looking at the small stories that Brigitte was talking about. But there is one actor throughout the debate tonight that I was kind of missing, and that's political parties. I mean, we've been talking about institutions, conferences, conventions, the parliament. We've been talking about elite politicians. But what about these party organizations that they don't really do it, or very little, but they can also organize transnationally. They can connect. That's their role. They can connect citizens with the institutions. And what are your ideas about how this historically happened in the EU? And linking to the first question, what about the potential for their future role? Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Gilles Pitours from EPRS for these two questions. I will put a benchmark question in front of Timofey. Well, the UK might not be the best benchmark to talk about unity, but how should we see it? Are we not too demanding from the EU?
Excellent question. Yes, I think in some parts yes, in some parts no. You would expect that probably. But where it's important, where we are too demanding of the European Union, I think the classic state, if you want, the EU could fit the description of a classic state, with one exception. There is no sense in people that they live in a shared place. That's all you need to know about this. And regardless of which passport you has, maybe it has a stamp of European Union on it. Maybe it doesn't have it yet if it's a new member state, a very new member state. There is still a perception that people belong to different political communities, and there is something overarching that is out there, but it's not the major point of reference for them. So I think in that regard, we cannot feel the expectations on citizens about the role that the EU should play in their lives. And this links, I think, to the second question about the parties quite well, because Well, in perception of what parties do, we, as people who vote, we obviously want them to represent us. But what parties do, they filter all of those interests that people bring to them into manageable policy proposals and laws that they advocate, that they believe, at least to an extent, could be realistically achieved. I think that is a very important corrective to the view of what parties, what role political parties have played and will continue to play in the context of European Union integration, but also from my perspective, also in the context of the wider Europe, in the Council of Europe, where people actually sit, not parties, not countries. And that is where interests have opportunities to form, or interest communities have an opportunities to form, rather than already pressed into those rigid party political spectra that we know across the board. So from both perspectives, the excellent question with two aspects, I think. We could expect more of European Union had we had a more coherent citizenry of European Union that identifies primarily with that union. It doesn't. But we expect too little of European Union in we should take European Union more by its own words, that promises the freedom from discrimination for all, the equality for all, and opportunity to pursue or to live self-determined life. And I think in many of these respects, there is much more that European Union can do for its own citizens, and as a result would lead to the evolution of what is, whether you want to call it EU demos or EU political community or citizenry.
Okay, thank you. Jacopo, do you want to add something? Do party matters in this respect?
They do, of course, and I do agree that we are sometimes too demanding towards what the EU should do or means. And we see that in the narrative, in the public perception of the EU, and we have a power in this sense, and I come back to what has been said before, to change the narrative. And I see that also, for instance, when I'm talking to the younger generation of students who come, for instance, to the educational program of the historical archives of the European Union where I'm working on, they are Europeans. Society is more Europeanized than the political space. This is something that we can see not only from historical research, but also from more direct impressions of talking to the young people. And so the problem is, how do we Europeanize the political space? Well, I think that as engaged citizens, we have some work to do in that respect, but we can do it. Of course, if we think to the European elections, if they are addressed like a matter of national politics, we're not doing much towards this goal of creating a European demos. But it's not something that must be taken for granted. We have agency in this respect. And if you think about political parties, well, of course, historically, transnational political federations, party federations have always been very weak. Political groups in the European Parliament have been strong and have real powers. But historically, we don't see a real power in transnational party federation. And this is something that has to do, on one side, with the difficulty to reconcile different political perspectives and national identities. If you think, for instance, of the major group in the European Parliament, the EPP, which in the beginning was the core of the federal option for the EU, Christian Democrats were engaged federalists. But then, with subsequent enlargements, new parties came in and diluted a little bit this federalist identity. So we have to keep in mind that when we enlarge and we keep many different political cultures and traditions together, it's a very complex process of renegotiating a political identity. So this is not a simple process. Sometimes the public perception is that it's all the EU's fault or the Commission's fault, but the process is very complex, and I think we have to work into changing this narrative about the EU and how the European citizens can engage into the Union.
Okay, thank you, panel members, for this critical approaches and also the answer to the questions. We'll wrap up with a final round. A question about your evaluation, what could be done better, but we'll turn it into a positive way. Let's finish on a positive note. If you would be in charge, what would you do? What would be your priority to increase maybe bottom-up approach about debating Europe? So in other words, what is your take-home message for today? And it's more like a take-future message for today. Brigitte, I will do it in the reverse order and start with Cristina.
Okay, so just in a sentence, and I think that beyond everything we have been discussing here today, I think there's a key question for the future. And if we have, instead of a sense of actual unity, we constantly have a sense of constant crisis, is because we are outgrowing ourselves as societies. So the idea I would like to bring home is, how can we grow inclusively? And I'm not talking just about material growth, I'm talking about how we are outgrowing ourselves as growingly interconnected societies, and how can we transform this process into a really inclusive one to guarantee mutual cooperation and enhancement in the future. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much for your contribution. Cristina, Jacopo, what is your take-home message? Wrap up in a positive way for this evening.
Well, I speak for myself as a scholar, but also as an educator. We have a job to do, and we can do it as if we want to articulate a more balanced view of the current debates over European unity. We need to take a look at what happened in the past and avoid to present simplistic narratives of maybe pro-European versus anti-European efforts. We need to transmit to the younger generations, in particular, how European integration has always been a contested battlefield where competing visions of Europe or even active contestation of European unity were at place long before the growth of Euroscepticism. So a historical understanding of the successes and failures of the efforts in debating Europe can make us, and this is my positive note, better equipped to take part in these debates today. I understand that this might be the biased plea of an historian, but in the end we are in the House of European History, so there is no better context for this.
No, indeed. Thank you very much. Timofey, same question to you.
Yes, I think there is a lot of positive, there are many positive lessons I think we can learn from the story of European integration, but the main one is that we, regardless of how we see the unity or who are the citizens of Europe, whichever Europe as well, there is an agreement on the type of relationship between people, the society, and the state that serves these people. And I think this is the strategy, this is the pathway forward that needs further consultations or discussion between society in Europe, in the EU, with representatives and with institutions that serve those societies. And why it is important, because now that we have that more or less unity about the fact that there needs to be, well, we need to have a dialogue about this. Where we see future conflicts emerging are on the periphery of what is Europe and what is the EU, and that is with countries, with societies where that dialogue is no longer possible or is circumscribed. Whether we're looking immediately on the border of the European Union, in countries that have elections running shortly, in Turkey, for example, or places where violent conflicts are taking place, where the state and society are still in conflict over how the relationship between state institutions and people that those institutions ought to be served need to take place. So a lot for Europe to project outside of its borders.
Yes, and a lot of food for thought. Thank you very much. Last but not least, Brigitte.
Yeah. I would say as a scholar, as an academic, I would reiterate it needs diversifying the narratives. There is a danger in this, and this is not positive, but that's the way it is. by diversifying, you lose the easy, the big one, the one that has the turning points, the milestones. Yeah, and people don't necessarily like this. So that's the one thing. That's also by going back to the unity, what my issue is with unity. As a European, I would say the one thing to do is strengthen social Europe, solidarity, redistribution, those were the things. That would be my positive, my vision, but I can't help, I always see the problems there. But if I had a wish, I would say then a stronger social Europe. That should be the way forward.
Okay, great, thank you. The last word is by Emma on behalf of the House of European History. Thank you very much, panel members, and as far as I'm concerned, happy Europe Day. Thank you.
Thank you to our panel members who shared their knowledge and insights with us today, and thank you to Steven for the moderation. I also want to extend my thanks to everyone who has joined us today, on-site and online. We hope you enjoyed the event. The whole panel debate will be available for you to rewatch on the YouTube channel of the House of European History. I wish you a nice evening and hope to see you again in our museum soon. Thank you.